Today, the fastest supercomputers in the world are powered by thousands of graphical processing units, or GPUs, which have tremendous computing power. The next generation of supercomputers are exascale machines that will also heavily use GPUs to boost compute power and provide high parallelism. On the right, you can see the list of top supercomputers in the world, which is updated regularly on the Top 500 website. These supercomputers are used to run simulations that help to understand natural phenomena, develop new technology, and so on. For example, the Summit supercomputer at Oak Ridge National Lab in the US was used to develop a multi-scale modeling framework for climate simulations. Scientific simulations are also used in medical technology. In fact, the particle accelerator in CERN, Switzerland, has been instrumental in developing cancer treatments, and this has all happened because, to start off, we have scientific simulation models of particle accelerators. Many scientific simulations use differential equation solvers, and these solvers work by discretizing a continuous domain and solving the system of equations to model different types of behavior. Discretizing a differential equation converts it into a linear system. Here, h is the system operator, and provided with an input x, it produces a response b. If the system is linear shift invariant, then the response is obtained by convolution of h with x. Since large-scale convolutions are of use in solving differential equations, they are of critical importance in many applications. An efficient way to compute them is to use fast Fourier transforms, or FFTs. However, when FFTs are parallelized, they require all-to-all communication between the parallel nodes, and this impacts performance significantly. A study showed that when a 1024 cube point FFT was computed in parallel on 4 CPU nodes, about 49% of the runtime was spent in communication and only 11% in computing the FFT. When accelerated using 4 GPUs, the communication time was 97% of the runtime, even though the computation was 43 times faster. Thus, for a simulation that might run for many days, 97% of the allocated research budget, amounting to several $1,000s, can be wasted because of communication latency. High communication is a real performance bottleneck. This is because communication involves loading and storing from memory. Over the last few decades, there has been a growing gap between memory speeds and compute speeds, as seen in the plot. The memory access is much slower than the speed at which we can compute on data. The use of accelerators for computing is making compute speeds faster and faster. But accelerators like GPUs have small memory capacity, and so loading and storing of data needs to be done often. And thus, current approaches to FFTs on GPUs suffer in performance because of their all-to-all communication requirements. Communication latency means that GPUs remain idle, leading to wastage of resources and money. Frameworks for reducing communication costs and increasing scalability are needed to make the best use of GPUs. The goals of this work are, first, to provide a proof-of-concept design for a method that avoids global communication during FFT-based convolution, particularly for large-scale scientific solver applications. And second, to demonstrate scalable convolution with efficient GPU use, approximating large-scale convolutions and ensuring localized computation to avoid repeated data transfer. I should mention that one of the non-goals for this work is to provide a massively parallel optimized implementation. Multidimensional FFTs can be performed one dimension at a time. There are two types of data decomposition. The first is 1D slabs, where 2 dimensions are computed on at a time, followed by the third dimension. The second is 2D pencils, where each dimension is computed on in separate stages. However, in both these methods, we can see that there are 1 or 2 stages of all-to-all communication, which, as we saw, due to the processor memory performance gap, is really bad for performance, and also scalability, because as the size increases, the all-to-all results in congestion of the network. A commonly used technique to solve differential equations, mainly certain types of linear inhomogeneous PDEs. The Green's function is sometimes called the influence function. Typically, it has decaying behavior and is used in differential equation solvers to obtain the influence of a particular point. So, linear constant coefficient partial differential equations can be solved by convolution with the Green's function. Our use case is a Hooke's law simulation known as MASSIVE, which computes stress and strain in materials. We choose the convolution in MASSIVE as our use case because of the following reasons. First, because the assumptions of the problem, including boundary conditions, are well stated. Secondly, and more importantly, MASSIVE is one example of a Green's function-based differential equation solver. Some other examples are simulations modeling heat flow or elasticity. Other simulations belonging to the same family can benefit from adapting our approach. Thirdly, the closed form of the Green's function for MASSIVE is known in the frequency domain. And finally, MASSIVE is a good use case because it's a perfect example of how large-scale convolutions become a bottleneck with high parallelism. Each iteration of MASSIVE requires multiple 3D convolutions, so the number of all-to-all communication rounds for each iteration is very high. So, MASSIVE iteratively computes stress and strain by performing a tensor contraction in each iteration. We use multiple 3D convolutions with the Green's function tensor in each iteration to obtain these stress and strain fields. MASSIVE uses FFTW in the parallel version, and the simulation is capped at 1024 cube grid points because of the memory and communication requirement. The 1024 cube grid already has a requirement of 2 terabytes. Doing all-to-all communication on such sizes makes it difficult to scale it further. Moving on to related work on parallel FFTs. There are many existing solutions for computing parallel FFTs. First are some modified communication pattern FFTs, such as the P3D FFT or 2D Comp FFT. There are also many HPC libraries, such as FFTW, which is the widely used standard, FFTE, which has many optimizations but it's restrictive in some ways, MKL, QFFT, HEFFT, which is an upcoming exascale framework. There are also special FFT frameworks like Spiral, and other approaches, including system-level approaches like DeltaFS file systems and so on. There have also been many methods that approximate the FFT. The first is Peter Tang's FFT, which is an approximate low communication 1D FFT that works by modulating the signal with a window function. Another is an inexact TFT by Alan Edelman, which uses approximate matrix vector approaches based on singular values. Sparse FFT from MIT depends on estimating the k largest magnitude coefficients of the Fourier transform while assuming that the Fourier transform is extremely sparse. However, the traditional approaches have some limitations. Some have restrictive APIs, so users cannot describe data patterns other than what is already defined. Some, like MKL, are closed source, so no functionality can be changed. There is no locality in FFT computation since it is parallelized across processors, and some frameworks like Spiral are useful but difficult to use for application developers as it requires intricate knowledge of high-performance computing. Moreover, the global communication requirement still exists because these frameworks still make all-to-all communication calls. The high memory requirement restricts their use on GPUs. And since these existing frameworks don't deal with this problem holistically, our contribution aims to address these issues. What we need to remember is the FFT is a means to compute convolution and not the goal of the computation. While traditional approaches optimize the FFT in isolation, we believe we should focus on optimizing the entire convolution pipeline by using properties of the input and the convolution kernel. The main components of the algorithm are domain decomposition, local convolution, which avoids all-to-all communication, adaptive sampling, and merging results. Our goal is to perform large-scale convolutions on GPUs, but GPUs have small memory. GPUs consist of many weak cores computing in parallel and require data supply at very high speeds. The on-device memory is very fast but small, typically up to 32 gigabytes. This requires us to often transfer data between the host device and the GPU. Since the GPU has small on-chip memory, we have no choice but to process the 3D input in parts called subdomains, which are offloaded to the GPU. This is known as domain decomposition. Using traditional methods, this would involve all-to-all communication, but our idea is to compute the FFT and convolution locally on each part within GPU memory. In order to reduce memory footprint, we show how the result can be compressed in order to fit into GPU memory, and the input subdomain can also be compressed if necessary. Processing the convolution of a subdomain locally within a GPU is non-trivial because an FFT-based convolution involves zero padding the input to the size of the output, which is very large. This will not fit into GPU memory, and so naive domain decomposition does not work for Fourier methods. We propose a local convolution that can fit into GPU memory. We do this by interweaving an adaptive sampling strategy to compress the result in between FFT stages. The input is zero padded only in the dimension in which we compute. The result is immediately compressed using a multi-resolution sampling strategy. There's a single all-to-all step at the end of the computation to exchange only sparse samples with other GPUs so that the full result can be computed. This reduces the multiple communication rounds that a traditional FFT library would have required. The adaptive sampling strategy is derived from the Green's function kernel. This kernel has a rapidly decaying form as seen from the plotted cross-sections. The gray areas are the regions where values are zero or negligible, and so we see that the kernel has this peak in the center, and then it decays off rapidly. When a band-limited signal is convolved with a sharp impulse-like signal, signal processing tells us that the result is also band-limited. So in such a case, we can sparse sample in the areas where we know the result will decay or have low values. This achieves two things. It makes domain decomposition work in Fourier domain, and it localizes the result so that the GPU memory is enough for computation. Here is the full pipeline of local convolution. GPU memory permitting, we may be able to batch process subdomains within GPU if we compress the convolution result. Thus, during the FFT and convolution, there is no all-to-all communication. Only the last step involves an all-to-all step to exchange sparse samples with other GPUs. The adaptive sampling works to reduce memory footprint, but it also computes an approximate result. The approximation error can be bounded by well-studied interpolation techniques that will be used to interpolate the full result from the sparse samples. In the interest of time, I will not go into too many details here, but the sampling strategy can be tuned to bound the error as per the requirements of the application. In order to treat the 3D grid using multi-resolution, some regions of the grid have high resolution while others have lower resolution, that is, fewer samples. In order to represent this efficiently, we pick the octree data structure. The octree is a hierarchical data structure based on recursive decomposition, mainly used to represent images or 3D point clouds. Octrees are used to partition a 3D space by recursively subdividing it into equal-size hypercubes called cells. Each cell in the tree stores information about the location and sampling rate of the region in the 3D grid. The octree is very useful in localizing samples and sampling rates within the grid, which is necessary when interpolating sparse samples to get the final result. This is the final step in our algorithm. Now let's look at the proof of concept, implementation, and results. Our hardware setup consists of a V100 GPU with 16 gigabytes of memory and another with 32 gigabytes of memory. Our implementation is done in CUDA with callback functions attached to cuFFT calls. Since our use case is the Hooke's law simulation called massive, we make certain assumptions for the inputs in line with the application. The most impactful result is that we could successfully scale a 3D convolution in double precision to grid sizes of 1024 cube points and 2048 cube points on a single GPU. Without our algorithm, convolutions of this size could only be performed in parallel on GPUs with all-to-all communication stages. Making a large-scale convolution feasible on a GPU means that we can increase the effective usage of the GPU, overcome the small on-device memory issue, reduce idle time, and reduce communication time. For various grid sizes and subdomain sizes, we compute approximation error for various downsampling rates. The error is the L2 relative error norm between the actual and approximate convolution result. Our proof of concept GPU implementation is compared against a CPU-only FFTW implementation that does not use any approximations. Our approximate error comes up to under 3% for the chosen downsampling rates as shown in the table. For massive, a fixed point simulation, convolution error up to 3% did not largely impact convergence or the number of iterations, so we design a heuristic sampling strategy accordingly. Particularly for massive, the FFT-based convolution created a bottleneck when porting to GPUs with traditional methods. However, our algorithm can enable the massive simulation to scale to larger 3D grids on GPUs. Previously, massive used CPUs and the FFTW library for parallel execution of convolution, but with GPU computing enabled, we can speed up the FFT by up to 24 times for 2048 cube points, and that would be extremely beneficial for large-scale stress and strain simulations. One caveat is that in the proof of concept implementation, there's a difference between the estimated memory usage and actual memory usage on a GPU. The difference between the values is due to the use of QFFT, which creates temporary variables in the midst of calculations. So to summarize, our algorithm enables large-scale convolutions on GPUs, and massive simulation can benefit from up to a 24 times speedup. The humble hardware setup is more powerful than before because a single node with a GPU can perform large-scale convolutions. Our experiments show a working solution using CUDA, but the work can now be taken further using multi-GPU implementations to solve even bigger grids. Now let's talk about efficient implementations and frameworks that can be used for algorithm specification. The use of QFFT does not allow us to fully optimize memory usage for the massive implementation. The multi-GPU pipeline will need to be hand-optimized. Upcoming exascale frameworks will be used to run these simulations, and they require software-hardware co-design and better frameworks for algorithm specification. The absence of a user-friendly algorithm specification framework makes it really difficult to write the code for such approximate algorithms. Our proposed algorithm design involves complex sampling patterns and interpolation interwoven with FFT and convolution operations. These operations are not easily expressible in any off-the-shelf FFT library, and code development for such algorithms can be difficult with a lot of room for error. Ffts is a new framework for building large-scale FFT-based applications. It builds on the FFTW interface while extending it to enable high performance on exascale machines. FFTX is designed to enable application developers to leverage expert-level automatic optimizations while navigating a familiar interface. The goal of FFTX is to provide user FFT functionality as well as algorithm building blocks, and to provide an interface for easier algorithm specification. So algorithm specification should be easy and involve only a few API calls instead of being hand-tuned code. The backend of FFTX is based on Spiral, which automatically maps computational kernels across a wide range of computing platforms to highly efficient code and proves the correctness of the synthesized code. This addresses two fundamental problems that software developers are faced with. First is the portability across the ever-changing parallel platforms, and second is verifiable correctness of sophisticated floating point code. Thus, the application developer does not have to worry about optimization across hardware platforms, which will be handled by Spiral. In our paper, we provide an example of how our code for massive convolution would look like in Ffts, and we can see that it significantly reduces in complexity. And now to the conclusions and future work. In conclusion, we show that using a single GPU proof of concept implementation, our experimental results show a reduction of memory footprint due to the adaptive sampling technique, coupled with the high accuracy of the approximate result, while also taking advantage of the GPU to accelerate computing speed. As for future work, we plan to extend the algorithm design to other similar spectral applications and to continue to develop the features of the Ffts library. And we also plan to add support for commonly used spectral solvers in Ffts.